What's up, everybody? This is Justin from Microdose, coming at you today with the MA Racing DLR8 build video. I'll go over a few small clips of how the car went together and my experience during the process. I'm going to call this carbon plate here the pivot block, because that's essentially what it's serving as. In the next photo, we'll get the ball studs attached with the nuts included, and then we'll start working on the front arms. This is where the build got interesting for me. I've been told by people online that the front control arms, of course it's a great design, don't get me wrong guys, it is genius once it's together, there is no play, but getting it adjusted properly can be a nightmare, and let me explain exactly why. Here's where the majority of the time went in this build. You're supposed to be able to thread one of the rod ends onto the little turnbuckle, then insert it through the actual control arm itself, slide on an O-ring, and then just simply thread on the other ball stud. Seems great, and then your adjustment dead center of the control arm will give you your width adjustment to get it perfect. Well, that's only if it works as intended. The problem I had was the ball studs wanted to continuously rotate inside the control arm, making it to where I had to have 2 or 3 hands to assemble this piece. Overall, it was a nightmare on the front. The rear went together absolutely perfect, so it was totally a experience may vary kind of situation. You may not find this being an issue. I personally did have it being an issue on the front. Like I said, it worked great on the rear. Hopefully it all goes smooth for you guys. Here we break into the steering bell crank, front shock tower, and bulkhead. Most of this process was very smooth and straightforward, although you'll see here in just a second, once I was done putting the bulkhead in place, I realized it was incredibly crooked. At first this was alarming, and I thought that we were going to have an issue with fitment, but all you really got to do is loosen the screws and position everything properly, as seen here. Moving on to the front shock tower, I immediately spot another problem. The screws included inside of the bag with the shock tower are M1.6 by 3s in my case, when they should have been M1.6 by 6. Not a big deal. I later found them in the kit, so it worked out and I just had to swap them out. But beware, just like stated in the instructions, check and make sure all of your screws are right before the car goes together. Moving on to the rear pivot block, everything went together very easy as intended, even up to the control arms. Everything went very smooth to the adjustment even. The top deck, on the other hand, went together very smooth, but the screws that attach it to the front bulkhead cannot be tightened properly. They instruct you to lift up the front brace like this to put your upper control arms underneath, and it just loosens the screws, and you can't get them tight because now they are blocked by the upper front control arms. Not a big deal, I guess, but you know, it's kind of disappointing. I figured they would just move that screw location and it would solve this problem completely. But it's not a deal breaker. The top deck was basically floating on the D24, so it wasn't super tight. So it's not really a performance drawback, if you will. Luckily, the front knuckles come with the bearings installed, so all you have to do is add the ball studs and the axle shaft. I went ahead and clipped them into place, although I was lazy and did not build my steering tie rods quite yet. Honestly, since the geometry wasn't set for the body, I didn't feel the need to build them yet, as they're going to get changed anyhow. Moving on to the transmission, everything was very high quality, easy to put together, and the instructions are incredibly concise. There's really nothing to mess up here. In fact, it was pretty satisfying, and I wind up just taking a bunch of photos of the transmission because it looked pretty good on the table by itself. Overall, I mean, the design of this car is really good, guys, and I mean, it should be. It's basically a clone of a Yokomo MD 2.0, and that has a winning pedigree. So this car kind of has a lot to live up to, but also has the proper bloodline starting out. Now we attach the upper chassis deck to the transmission itself and get ready to put together the battery tray on the rear adjustable section of the chassis itself. Everything went together very smooth once again. There's really not many issues with assembly on this car. Next, we move on to the rear control arms, knuckles, turnbuckles, and toe blocks. Real quick though, before we move on any further, these shims and screws were included in the kit but were not outlined in the instructions. No one has clarified this yet, but these work perfect for widening the rear control arms and getting the rear width of the car set to what you want. You have up to 3 millimeters of adjustment on either side, so there's plenty to play with. Here's a few more pictures of assembling the rear suspension. This go around, I pre-threaded the rod ends onto the turnbuckles, and I think that helped a lot. This kept the rod end essentially from spinning in the control arm when I was trying to tighten everything down, and was probably the issue I had going, back to the front, now that I think about it. Note though, they don't tell you to do this. It's just a good practice. The exact same thing goes for your turnbuckles used for camber adjustment. If you pre-thread these rod ends, it's going to make your life a lot easier. Another topic we need to cover is massaging the rod ends so they're not necessarily loose on the ball stud, but have free movement on the ball stud. This is truly key to having proper working suspension. Here's a quick video concerning the rod ends and ball studs on the lower front control arms, and this is going to apply to any of the ball studs or rod ends on any car pretty much you're going to find. A lot of them are pretty stiff from the factory, so you want to take a pair of needle nose pliers like so, and you want to squeeze from, say, this back corner across to this corner, and then you want to go from this corner across to this corner. So you want to do this in an X-style fashion until you get these rod ends loose on the ball stud just enough to where you have free suspension movement. If not, see, if you don't do anything with it, that's what you end up with. They don't move under their own weight, and this causes not a lot of suspension bind, but enough to where your suspension is not going to move freely. Whereas right here, I have already hit the ball studs with the needle nose pliers, and you can see that it free floats and does exactly what it's supposed to do with proper suspension movement. Now that we got that out of the way, we'll cover a little bit of electronics install. The servo went in pretty smooth. I did notice that there's play in the actual mounts themselves, up and down, so if you just throw the mounts on the servo, it might not sit level in the car. You kind of need to have everything loose when you place it on the chassis and then tighten it up. Quickly throw the pivot ball and the servo horn, then you can move on to the suspension. I found here you want to thread the set screws into the pivot balls and then thread those into the control arms, or your life's going to probably be a nightmare. Let's talk preload real quick before moving on. On the front shocks, I ran the collars down until they were tight with the front springs, and then on the rear, there's actually no preload at all. I'm just doing this right now because I'm not running a body and we're still in the whole shakedown process. But this will likely be adjusted down the road when a full detailed body is added. Next up is the ESC mount, front bumper, and the rear body mount bracket. I ran across the same issues with the rear body mount bracket as I did with the front bulkhead. There's just a little bit of play in the screws, so loosen it up and get everything centered by eye and you'll be good to go. Beware, the optional idler gear is awesome, but is kind of difficult to get tight. Make sure you put Loctite on all of this, of course, but also you gotta have good tools. I don't remember the exact screwdriver size used, but just make sure you get a good one that fits properly and ensure that it's tight. While you're staring at this beautiful motor, let me tell you about a quick tip. I use shoe goo for all of my electronics installs. The ESC has been glued into place. It's not ideal sometimes because you do have to make sure things are held right where you want them until it tacks up, but it gives you the adequate amount of dampening for, say, the gyro, and then has enough hold to where it's going to be impact resistant, but yet is also easily removable. Another big bonus is it does not get hair attached to the edges of it like back-to-back tape. Another disclaimer, we're now moving on to the rod used from the servo to the actual bell crank itself. And it all seems very straightforward, but beware because you want to have your servo positioned in the chassis to where you know you have adequate fitment for your battery and the gyro. I'm right now limited on wheelbase with my gyro being on the bottom deck, so I can only go to about 102 or 103 millimeter wheelbase minimum without moving around the electronics. The issue is I really like where the electronics are, so they're going to stay. Here's a small 3D printed piece I whipped up just so I could retain the sensor wire on the ESC. I routed it probably some weird way that I shouldn't had, but I wanted it to take up the full length of the wire so it just looked proper in the chassis. Here's another simple 3D printed piece I came up with. It's just a little clip-on wire retainer to keep the look of the car pretty clean overall. Here's a few more quick photos of wire management in the rear of the car. Overall, it turned out pretty good, and I'm looking forward to getting this thing on the track for proper testing. Keep an eye out for my next video where we will do a full review and shakedown of the car. Thanks.